Hello and welcome to the weekly briefing for Global Conflict 1. In this video I'll be covering days 137 to 143, and as usual doing my best to document the various political changes that have occurred within that time frame. So we have a couple of important topics on the plate for this week's video. First off, House 10 has been doing quite terribly in defending their own country against House 15's advances. Now both House 15 and House 10 have a fair share of farming players in their respective houses, but House 10, it seems, has not done as good a job as House 15 of warding off attacks. Plus there's the fact that House 15 has more aggressive fighters in them. What it comes down to a lot of the times is a couple of factions with the most fighters in them are the ones pulling the majority of the weight in these wars, and when it comes down to the House 15 versus House 10 conflict, it seems like House 10 has the shorter end of the stick there, which is really unfortunate for House 10. It would be interesting to know how their continued war with House 19 impacted this outcome, because I imagine a good deal of their resources were split off. If I recall correctly, in a past video, I mentioned the fact that at least one of their factions was taking care of the European front. They were solely diverting their attention to that theater, while the rest of the factions were pulled back and attempting to defend the homeland of South America, while at the same time pushing into North America. So I imagine their forces were split a good deal compared to House 15, who had made peace with House 19 before that, and they were able to focus all of their attention on House 10. Now, House 15 and House 10 allegedly did have a meeting, but one of the conditions would be that the House Marshal of House 10 would have to be replaced, and House 10 soundly rejected this proposal, so it appears that those negotiations have reached an impasse and will ultimately only be decided once House 10 has been solidly beaten. It is much like House 19. Now, when it comes to House 19, you probably remember that they declared war on House 9 last week after one very prominent House 17 faction left House 17 and joined House 19. Obviously, this was a faction that House 19 was at war with, and they weren't going to allow them to control the majority of Australia. So after House 19 declared war on House 9, House 9 started pushing into the Balkans area, and you may notice that especially Romania has been flipped to House 17. Now, according to a person from House 19 on the ground here, how this went down was there were players friendly to House 17 and House 9 residing in those areas, the Balkan areas, and they have been trading off their villages to House 9 and House 17 players. So a lot of those villages that were taken in there were actually taken via friendly captures. And I'm not sure if that's really all that significant, but it shows again that House 10 was working with House 9 and House 17 in this case, which makes sense because those two alliances are at war with House 19. But then interestingly enough, one faction from House 2 dropped House and decided to join the House 9 side of the coalition against House 19. So you might think ultimately that's pretty insignificant. Yes, it is, because they are very small countries, and overall House 19 is looking much better than the position they found themselves in not more than a month ago, with 4 major alliances breathing down their neck. But one of the problems here with House 19 is they have been fighting for a long time, over 110 days or so, I believe, and apparently a significant number of their players are low enough on faith points that it actually became an issue, and a good deal of them were interested in, a good deal of the higher up members were interested in Spartak attempting to negotiate a peace with one of the houses that House 19 was at war with. Ultimately, this didn't go through. As you probably are familiar, Spartak is considered quite an inspirational leader of House 19. He has held the entire alliance together quite proficiently. It takes a great deal of leadership ability to be able to hold together an alliance as vast as what House 19 controls, especially in the face of a world united against you in war. So something as small as some dissent amongst the other leading generals is likely not going to pan out too well for them. Apparently some of them left the house in an attempt to go and farm up more faith points, so That is one thing about the Russian houses. House 19 has a lot of players in it, and a lot of them can just drop under the radar and go neutral and farm up faith points, and nobody's really going to notice. Obviously, if these are higher level players, it's more likely that they are already individually flagged as enemies by the brass in the houses that are fighting against them, but at the same time, it is a good strategy for their playstyle. So when it comes to House 11, House 19 is finally going to declare war on them officially. I know it is quite unbelievable that up to this point, House 19 has avoided war with House 11 despite their open alliance with House 10. Apparently that's about to change, likely because House 11 is actually pushing up against House 19 here on the map. As you can see, they invaded the Middle East, and they have taken over Iran in this most recent week. So I suppose House 19 is now seeing them as a bit more of a threat and is less likely or inclined to just leave them alone. In addition to this, although House 11 has been successful in taking a couple of countries there in the Middle East, they have also lost a couple of factions, so that brings them down a bit. House 15 has also recruited a couple of factions, or is in the process of doing so, so that will be bolstering one side and diminishing the structure of the other. So with all that out of the way, let's cover some country changes. Greenland has flipped from neutral to House 7. Colombia has flipped from neutral to House 10. Peru has flipped from House 10 to neutral. Brazil has flipped from House 10 to House 15. Chile has flipped from House 10 to House 15. Argentina has flipped from House 10 to House 15. Spain has flipped from House 19 to House 10. Romania has flipped from House 19 to House 17. Iran has flipped from House 15 to House 11. Algeria has flipped from House 9 to neutral. This is a little bit interesting when it comes to Algeria, and it is the last of the major country changes in the past week. But Algeria was prior to this week in House 9, and the faction left over some dispute between House 9, and now they're simply acting in their own interests. I'm not exactly sure they're actually fighting House 9 at the time, although that is likely, but from the reports that I've heard, they're also a very local group that is likely indigenous to that area in the real world, so they're rather a nationalistic group, I guess you could say. Moving on to county and province changes. One of the small gains by House 10 in the past week was the northeast of the United States has flipped from House 15 to House 10. The south has also flipped from House 15 to House 10. Cuba has flipped from House 10 to House 15. The northeast region of Brazil has flipped from House 10 to House 18. House 18, of course, is a part of the House 15 alliance. Moldova has flipped from House 19 to neutral. Southern Italy has flipped from House 10 to neutral. Switzerland has flipped from House 19 to House 10. Eastern Turkey has flipped from House 15 to House 10. Syria has flipped from House 11 to neutral. North Saudi Arabia has flipped from House 11 to neutral. Armenia has flipped from House 11 to neutral. Tajikistan has flipped from House 18 to House 11. Kazakhstan has flipped from House 5 to House 9. Uzbekistan has flipped from House 5 to House 9. UAE has flipped from House 15 to House 11. Morocco has flipped from House 9 to House 19. Vietnam has flipped from House 9 to House 5. Laos has flipped from House 9 to House 5. South India has flipped from House 20 to neutral. Central Indonesia has flipped from House 19 to House 17. Sumatra has flipped from House 19 to House 9. Java has flipped from House 20 to neutral. Oriental has flipped from House 9 to House 5. Chad has flipped from House 9 to House 19. East Libya has flipped from neutral to House 9. And Tunisia has flipped from House 10 to House 15. I think that pretty much covers everything to do with this week. As always, if you have any information you think may be of use to this report, please do get in contact with me in-game, and I'll do my best to include your information in the next report, although I won't make any promises. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next week.
Stronghold Kingdoms. What will you fight for? Play now for free.